Okay, then.
Okay,
It will
so
also be captioned.
yes, there are auto captions enabled. Hopefully it's makes the event more accessible to folks. And yeah, so welcome to our Unpacking Food Trauma event. This event is co-hosted by the Student Environmental Resource Center and SCECon, which my co-organizer will help to provide a little more context on later. But my name is Nasim and I use they, them pronouns, and I'm an intern at the Student Environmental Resource Center. And before we get into anything, I will provide a land acknowledgement for us. And also please feel free to share the native land you're currently on. You can use the website nativeland.ca to find out if you're unsure. And yeah, so UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. The successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County, this land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the UC Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As members of the Berkeley community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also we recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jed, would you like to provide some more context on SCECon and CERC?
Yeah, so the Student Environmental Resource Center, or SCEC, is the kind of the environmental hub on our campus, and we strive to support student sovereignty, bold imagination, and just working towards providing resources for the environmental community on campus. In addition, this event is also part of the Students of Color Environmental Conference hosted by the Students of Color Environmental Collective. And our theme this year is Our World, Our Time, Our Voices. And we really want to recenter the environmental movement around diverse perspectives and justice, and really looking at intersectional movements. Yeah, so if you are interested in our event, we still have a bunch of workshops coming up, but you can check out our past events as well. But thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, everyone. I guess with that said, I would like to begin. So my name is Dr. Amy Breeze Harper. You can just call me Breeze. I am coming to you from Ohlone land in Berkeley, California. And this event, usually when I do workshops, they're several hours long, but I tried to tailor it so it can be about an hour and I guess 30 minutes. So I asked people to read an article that I had written. It was about 8 years ago, and that was a draft. It was called Doing Veganism Differently, Racialized Trauma and Healing. And I just want to get a sense of how many people actually ended up reading that. In the chat if people are able to do that. Okay, and it's okay, you don't, so one that did not have to read that to be part of this. The point of it was for you to kind of get a sense of how I'm using this concept of trauma-informed practice to really understand the intersections of food justice and racial justice and healing through cultivating the land and eating. And that essay had touched a lot upon on the ways in which Bryant Terry had premiered his new book and at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco about 8 years ago. And image on the projector had been stuck on a watermelon. And he had kind of talked about how this was timely because he didn't actually taste a slice of watermelon until he was 17 years old. And it was because as a Black man in the United States, there were certain connotations that food had within the white imagination of how Black people should behave or perform. And he said, because of the watermelon being the stereotype of buffoonery that Black people were expected to engage in, his parents didn't want him eating it. And that just really led me into thinking about the ways in which things like food that should be pleasurable can also like intersect with the trauma of bringing a racial caste system. And then Bryant Terry's work, who's an eco chef and vegan, that he kind of takes the trauma of being in this racial caste system, the pathologization of soul food and Black people, and creating a different take on it, that not to pathologize it, but really understanding the trauma of being part of a racial caste system, the trauma and the violence of quote unquote nation building that requires, in the context of how the United States was established, require the colonizers to come in and enact indigenous genocide and then also enslave Africans. So lots of trauma going into that, and then up to that point where that book was published. And I found that really interesting, and just a way to really understand how trauma also informed my own understanding of why I'm interested in food justice, writing about veganism, and really understanding those histories. So if you didn't actually get a chance to read it, it's okay. But for those of you who did, I will have a question or two for you if you want to share that on chat or just something to think about. So with that said, I wanted to talk about this concept of trauma and food. So recently, a few years ago, I read a report about how trauma-informed framework is essential in creating food policies to kind of tackle the United States problem with food insecurity. So I want to read you a quote from the article. Quote, trauma is broadly defined as an experience that is emotionally painful, distressful, or shocking. It often results in long-term mental and physical health consequences. Trauma can occur from singular incidents or repeated or prolonged exposures to negative conditions. Given the painful and distressing nature of food insecurity and the physical and mental health consequences that often accompany it, we argue that for many, food insecurity creates trauma. Food insecurity is often also accompanied by other poverty-related stressors that worsen the traumatic impact. Additionally, individuals experiencing food insecurity may engage in risky behaviors to meet their needs, which could increase the potential for trauma. Accordingly, solutions to address food insecurity should employ a trauma-informed approach. And I thought, even though this focuses on the subject of food insecurity, I argue that a trauma framework is applicable to all aspects of food since 1619, if not before, in the United States, because the food system was built on the trauma and violence, like I said, of nation building through genocide of indigenous people in order to steal their land and resources, which was a source of food and cultivation for a healthy ecosystem, and through the enslavement of millions of Africans to cultivate the land and build an agricultural system that was the blueprint for the modern day food system in the United States and beyond. So it is this history of nation building and food systems building that I focus on when we talk about unpacking food trauma within the Foodscape. And that's one of the titles of this presentation. So what is a foodscape? So a foodscape is a fancy and creative way to emphasize the spatialization of foodways and the interconnections between people, food, and places. So foodscape, which is drawn from landscape, is a term used to describe a process of viewing a place in which food is used as a lens to bring into focus selected human relations. And such human relations I've studied are the human relations born out of the production of food and food culture, et cetera, within a racial caste system in the United States from over the past 400 years. So as a cultural food materialist, I've been trained in the methodologies of Black Marxism, Black feminism, and critical race theories, to name a few. And through the lens of these methodologies via storytelling, I found that food objects can really tell us a lot about racial power dynamics within a capitalist moral system. More specifically, the US is currently in a neoliberal era of Black liberation, the rise in belief that ethical capitalism and consumerism and plant-based dietary commodities will save the planet from climate change, and that technocracy can pave an equitable future for all. So within this framework of green capitalism fused with technocratic solutions, there has been very little critical engagement with questioning the violence and trauma of capitalism itself. So whether it is green or not, capitalism is still capitalism and cannot exist without exploitation, violence, and systemic oppression for the most part. As a matter of fact, scholars such as Cedric Robinson and Angela Davis and Gay Johnson understand this all too well, arguing that racial capitalism has and continues to build and organize the economy, monetary and moral economy of the United States. But before I go deep into this, I want to kind of step back a bit and kind of talk about what may have inspired you to think about certain things in the article that I sent you to read. So for those of you who did read that article, I wanted to know, what did the essay inspire you to think about in terms of food and trauma and healing and resilience? And are there ways that you have engaged in food justice that racialized trauma has impacted you as a non-white person? So
I didn't necessarily read the article, but did read your foreword. And something that inspired me about the foreword was that you talked about something that Dick Gregory said about how he thinks or just saw that the trauma that an animal experiences passes through us as we eat and consume them.
Mm-hmm.
And that really inspired me to keep reading, because that's just a thought that I just continuously had. And I like that you acknowledged the other perspective of Afro veganism or just POC veganism, which was more about the decolonization and moving away from, I don't know how to say it, from cultural foods that had harmed us, or just the pathologies around food that we had continued to eat because of it was considered culture, even though it was manifested through our oppression in the United States. So yeah, that inspired me to keep reading.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. I do want to let people know it was written 8 years ago, and I've evolved even more in how I'm thinking about these things. But that's just kind of to get people a sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about racialized trauma and food and healing. Did anybody else want to talk about anything that was inspired by that essay, or even if you didn't read the essay, just some of these concepts? I can't see anyone's faces, so I'm probably making funny faces just to make sure that people know that I'm listening. I usually I think the last time I gave a talk at UC Berkeley, it was in person, so I'm still going to get used to this different way of engaging. See quite a bit of people that I know. Okay, so if you haven't read the essay, it's okay. But what I really want to dive into is how since then that my thoughts around this concept of unpacking food trauma has evolved, okay? And the ethical foodscape is huge. I mean, you can talk about locavourism, you can talk about going to farmers markets or doing veganic farming. What I'm really interested in is focusing on what vegan food commodities can tell us about a racial caste system and the power dynamics and how this plays out in foodscapes. So I am a cultural food materialist, and I'm really interested in the narratives that are behind certain ethical commodities, like the purity narratives. A lot of times it's post-racial. And one of the things I want to actually talk about is something that happened back in 2014. And it deals with the cookbook Thug Kitchen. Though it's not an actual food, it is a food object or item, okay? So, and it deals with kind of the intersections of ignoring the racial trauma of the word thug in that history. So at the beginning of October 2014, oops, let me change the slide. Sorry about that. At the beginning of 2014, October, news was firing around in my Facebook circle that the popular blog Thug Kitchen had just released a cookbook. However, that was not a surprise, as it is not common for outrageously popular culinary bloggers to find themselves with a lucrative book deal. What had my social media apps on fire was the news that the identities of the authors were not a couple of Black men who were from, quote unquote, the hood and experienced thug life. The authors of Thug Kitchen were a white LA couple. When asked why the Thug Kitchen creators hid their identities for so long, Matthew Holloway, one of the co-founders, responded that it was, quote unquote, racist to even ask the question of the skin color of he and his co-founder, Michelle Davis. Now, this response sent a ripple through the Vegans of Color group book Facebook groups. Immediately, the members of some of the Vegans of Color's Facebook groups found the defensive answer in dishonesty of hiding their identities for so long, entrenched in cultural appropriation of the word and experience thug. So a significant number of Vegans of Color began to mobilize via the internet and created an anti-racist Vegans of Color group. The function of the group was to organize and protest Thug Kitchen book tour. So I myself had mixed feelings. It wasn't that I thought Thug Kitchen was the sole problem. The controversy surrounding Thug Kitchen and the significant number of white vegans who thought it wasn't racist, while a significant number of Vegans of Color who thought it was quite telling. Also, I got involved with the Facebook chats occurring about Thug Kitchen. I find myself becoming more and more tense and quite sad around the responses that so many white identified vegans had towards the anger that Vegans of Color had about the use of the word thug. Now, while Vegans of Color and their allies were trying to explain the context of using the word thug in light of Oscar Grant, Jordan Davis, Trayvon Martin, and Michael Brown's murder, an overwhelmingly high number of white vegans were in complete disagreement that the word thug had any racist or racialized connotations at all. So Thug Kitchen and Vegans of Color protest was a microcosm that reflected the 2014 current racial climate in the United States. The book's supporters and post-racial comments by a significant number of mostly white people, it said a lot. To me, it said, quote, I don't have the trauma of racialized and state violence against my body that Black people do and other racial minorities. Why should I care about the word thug and the racially violent history and recent events, such as Oscar Grant and Michael Brown's murder, that trail behind it? As a matter of fact, I don't even have to realize that the term has been racialized and used against murder victims, such as Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin, to justify their deaths. So that's what, it really said to me. And then in October of 2014, I searched for book titles with thug in the title on Amazon. Over 100 titles came up, and more than 90% of these titles depicted Black characters on the cover and focused on urban Black life. Mostly novels from urban lit genre, it was obvious to me that the connotation of thug is Black, urban, and gangsta, and reflects the embodied experiences and perspectives from people who identify as Black and urban and from, quote unquote, the hood. It was obvious that this is how the Thug Kitchen authors were using the word thug. Also in 2014, when I typed in thug in the Google search engine, the most popular information that comes up is Tupac Shakur's Thug Life. Tupac writes about what he means when he says thug life, quote, commonly mistaken for a criminal, thug life is the opposite of having all he needs to succeed. Thug life is when you have nothing and succeed, when you have overcome all obstacles to reach your aim, end quote. And in a 1994 interview, Tupac sheds more light on how he is invoking the term thug life, quote, my mother was a woman, a Black woman, a single mother raising 2 kids on her own. She was dark-skinned, had short hair, got no love from nobody except for a group called the Black Panthers. I don't consider myself to be straight militant, I'm a thug. And my definition of thug comes from half of the street element and half of the Panther element, half of the independence movement. saying we want self-determination. We want to do it by self-defense and by any means necessary. That came from my family, and that's what thug life is. It's a mixture, end quote. So, did you hear that? He's talking about Black Panthers and the reality of street life. And really, to understand the Thug Kitchen and that project and that cookbook, what the project did was it took a bunch of vegan culinary recipes and put curse words throughout it. Here's some mother herbal tea recipe, just always cursing, cursing, cursing. And what was interesting is that thug life authors had appropriated the word or experience of thug life. They relied on the white supremacist imagination of what thug means. Tupac even talks about how mainstream media had made him and this concept of thug negative, as Black men who only use profanity and do not have much depth or intelligence are just violent. When applied to how thug is being experienced by protesting vegans of color, this is what Thug Kitchen feels to them: a minstrel show of foul-mouthed Black people who, even when given the chance to create a vegan cookbook, would put in profanities after every other recipe ingredient. There wouldn't be any of the depth of understanding that Tupac and others have who have the embodied knowledge of thug life. The author's appropriation of the word thug becomes problematic because it not only erases the significance of Tupac's thug life essence, it becomes a mockery via how a white LA pro-vegan couple thinks or imagines how inner city Black people from the hood would communicate culinary ideas about healthy and ethical eating. When Tupac talks about obstacles to achieving a healthy and economically stable life, he's talking about factors such as environmental racism, food apartheid, racial profiling, lack of adequate healthy living resources, all factors that will affect the ease of going vegan and making holistic and healthy meals that are in the Thug Kitchen cookbook. For those mostly white people defending Thug and the project as having absolutely no racist impacts, it's a scary implication of how many white people with good intentions do not know how systemic racism and white supremacy operate, do not know how to be real anti-racist, and are in fact non-racist, which is a neutral stance that allows racism and white supremacy to continue being the center ideology of the United States moral fabric, political system, health system, food system, etc. So Thug Kitchen blog in the book at the time did not address the lack of easy access to healthy and holistic life that one finds in geographies of thug life that Tupac comes from. And such geographies can also be referred to as what geographer Neil Smith calls uneven geographies. Now, critical race geographers such as Catherine McKittrick, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and Clyde Woods have added a racial component to this concept of uneven geographies. Such a racialized component shows the social and economic devastation that ongoing consequences of neocolonialism, fused with white supremacist-based capitalist system, have caused within Brown and Black communities throughout the United States. For Tupac, the strategy in using the word or concept thug life is political and consciousness raising, a way to encompass non-white ontology and bring forth how a Black racialized consciousness impacts Black ontology within white settler nations like the United States. So while I was searching through the entire Thug Life cookbook, there were no reflections on racism, food justice, whiteness, privilege, environmental racism, or food apartheid, which was referred to as food deserts at the time. There was no critical engagement with neoliberal capitalist food system. Even more interestingly, there was no definition of the word thug or even any reference to Tupac or similar people with Tupac's thug life experience. And as we go back, as I was talking about Bryant Terry, at that time, Bryant Terry was also troubled by what was going on with Thug Kitchen and the cookbook release. And he became unsettled that the authors purposefully did hide their identities for so long and did not want to talk about the racial or racist components to their use of thug and what they hoped it would elicit from their prospective audiences. So it was this lack of transparency and lack of willingness to admit that thug is a problem, especially during the midst of Michael Brown's death, Oscar Grant and Trayvon Martin, that had inspired Bryant Terry to actually write a long, thoughtful piece about Thug Kitchen on CNN. But what I noticed on his public page was that he had put, if you have ever raised hell about animals being killed and you are not raising hell about the police in Ferguson, Missouri, killing Mike Brown, a child, then using his supposed theft of a cigar to justify said killing, defriend, unfollow me ASAP. So what had been occurring at that time was that, and I had noticed this too, was that many well-intentioned white vegans were saying things like, well, what do you expect if you're going to steal something? And what do you expect if you don't abide by the law, right? And then here's Bryant, who's kind of witnessing this, this award-winning vegan chef, and really understanding what it means to actually be racialized as a thug in this country. That for him, it's this thing where it doesn't matter if you wear a hoodie or not, you're just kind of racialized as a thug, you're treated that way through the white imagination, and no one deserves to be treated that way. So you're in this space on social media where white vegans who want to be ethical because they're engaging in veganism have no sympathy or understanding of how traumatizing it is to live in a foodscape where things like this happen, to people like Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin, and basically simplify it that if you would just listen to the law, or if you just wouldn't steal this or that, then maybe you'd still be alive. And I want to actually focus on a lot of people saying, if you shouldn't just steal a cigar. And I want to focus on this in terms of analyzing what a cigar can tell us within the vegan foodscape. So cigars are conceived as, in terms of ethical consumption, as unhealthy. And I started wondering if responses would have been different had he supposedly stolen a more ethical food item, such as a bunch of kale or a pack of organic tofu. Well, the discussion amongst so many white vegans who implied Brown deserved what he got changed. So the current racial or material meanings of kale and organic tofu communicate a closer proximity to quote unquote civilized whiteness than a cigar within the ethical foodscape of mainstream vegan politics. So if you recall, Eric Garner's encounter with the police also came out of similar circumstances in which he was selling loose cigarettes, which is a quote unquote petty crime and illegal. And though it wouldn't happen until 2 years later, there was also much focus on what Elton Sterling was selling at night after he had been shot and killed by the police. He had been selling CDs on the corner. So the commodities in which he was selling significantly shaped how much of white America viewed his proximity, not only to whiteness, but to humanity. Once again, in returning back to Michael Brown, had once again, in returning back to Eric Garner, had he been, selling broccoli and artisanal vegan cheese without a license to vend, would, he also have had similar responses of lack of sympathy or empathy. And I think about this in terms of Michael Brown and in terms of Eric Garner. So, as a matter of fact, would these items have even been mentioned, since they don't really elicit a scary image of a Black man on the street corner in the same way that focusing on a Black man selling bootleg or homemade CDs would? So Sterling and Garner were part of the alternative economy of hustling in order to bring food to the table for their families. So we're talking about, the first definition of understanding food and trauma and food insecurity. That's why I start off with that definition. So they were trying to scrap together money in the underground economy where Black men in particular struggle to access formal jobs, have long had to hunt for income. So Tracy McMillan Cottom, a sociologist at Virginia Commonwealth University, would point this history out 2 years after Brown's death, focusing on the implication of Sterling's death, and wrote, quote, "Has it been this dangerous for the hustle man since post-Reconstruction, selling loosies, CDs, et cetera, Black informal economy," end quote. And as tech entrepreneur Anil Dash would argue after Sterling's murder, Garner and Sterling were engaged in quote unquote disrupting the market, just like those who started Uber and Airbnb. And he tweeted, quote, "You know how Silicon Valley advocates an Uber-esque model where everyone is an entrepreneur, disrupting markets while the law lags behind? Realize that Eric Garner and Elton Sterling were brutally killed for being Black while selling cigarettes and CDs, cheap consumer products. Alton Sterling and Eric Garner were killed by cops for bending the law to far lesser degree than execs at Airbnb and Uber. Billions versus bullets, end quote. So one cannot ignore this larger foodscape in which Brown and Garner and Sterling were surviving in. So this is a foodscape much where there's food insecurity, there's surveillance. If people are familiar with Dr. Nia Jones' work about how corner stores for decades have been these points of over surveillance by police in Black communities, right? So we're talking about not just these commodities, but the impact of these traumatic processes that they have on these communities that are already disenfranchised and already in food apartheid. So just really understanding the context of all of this is really important as we really talk about trauma and unpacking food trauma, and not just food that we eat, but the sites where there is food, like corner stores. So a lot of what you hear of when there is violence against Black men from police officers, it's around or near corner stores. So just really think about that. Many people, most of my clients that I deal with, I do anti-racism training. A lot of them are white people who engage in food and ethical food, and they don't have a concept of understanding this. So it's really interesting to see that what most non-white people understand, most white people who actually have more income, have more wealth, have more startup funding to build a future of ethical foods, they don't even understand that. Things as basic but complex as corner stores being sites of surveillance and control in heavily policed areas in Black communities. So these are kind of the things that I was thinking of when I was thinking about like sites of trauma and unpacking food trauma, and the ways in which Thug Kitchen silences and kind of uses cultural appropriation of this concept of thug, and kind of silencing the actual trauma of being racialized as thug in the United States as a brown or Black person. So those are the complexities that I'm trying to deal with and really understanding as we're talking about foodscapes and ethics and the future of food justice. So I'm going to take a break here. I'm going to see if anyone has any questions, because we're going to go into kind of some exercises. And it's okay if you don't. Type them in those anonymous forms to think about it, and then I try to answer.
There's a question in the form. Can you explain the difference between food apartheid and food deserts?
Yeah, so they're the same, except I use food apartheid because when deserts are thought of as something that is naturally occurring in the environment. Okay, like let me just go to the national park, Death Valley, a desert, beautiful natural occurring desert. They're not naturally occurring. When we move into the language of apartheid, we understand it's something that has been strategically orchestrated to disenfranchise and control a population. So that's why there's been that shift in that language, that food deserts, it doesn't lead many people to think more critically about it because it's just naturally occurring. But apartheid is something that has been strategically engineered within a racial caste system, where we started off in South Africa, where apartheid was used, but now we can actually use that language when we're talking about carefully orchestrated food insecurities or environments where there is lack of healthy, holistic, balanced food access by powerful entities, political and economic forces within a racial caste system. So that's why we shift the language to apartheid, to really acknowledge that. Was I able to answer your question? I hope so. And I ask people to really think about that when we talk about just unpacking food trauma, what it means to use the right types of language to actually explain those experiences. So shifting from concepts like deserts weren't actually occurring, to apartheid allows you to think more deeply about, hey, apartheid, well, let me try to think more about that. Isn't apartheid what was happening in South Africa? So that's what's happening with food too. So that's why it's important to start even decolonizing the language that a lot of us have been taught, even within food justice. And I'm still doing that and using that as a process. Okay, so what I wanted to do is, I don't know if we should do breakout rooms, because I mean, there's a lot of people here. I expected 30, but it looks like there's like 60. And I'm trying to figure out how feasible it is to have a breakout room versus people, responding in the comments or raising their hand, I don't know. I'm trying to get a sense of if breakout rooms would make sense for a crowd this big, where if we had 6 breakout rooms and there would be like 10 people in each room, that's too big. So I want to get a sense of, how the audience feels about breakout rooms versus me just kind of asking these questions and people raising their hand to speak or type. So I'm just looking at some of the responses. Okay, I see. Just trying to take a vote. Okay. Okay, raising hand. Looks like some people are like, I'm burned out from classes. I need to raise. Okay, so let's do the raising hand thing, and maybe we can. I have other exercises that maybe we'll just Okay, great. We'll start off with raising hands then. Okay, so here's a question for you. Which was supposed to be breakout. So I would like people to think about that, okay? So had Michael Brown been selling broccoli and artisanal vegan cheese without a license to vend, what do you think the responses would have been within the context of what I was talking about, where Bryant Terry and I were looking at some of these spaces on social media, and a significant number of white vegans were, saying, you shouldn't be stealing cigars, and they're unhealthy anyway. As a matter of fact, would these items have been mentioned, since they don't really elicit a quote unquote scary image of a Black man on the street corner in the same way that focusing on a man maybe selling bootleg or homemade CDs would? So I put that question out there. I think that's something that even like 8 years later, I'm just really, really thinking about. So if people want to, they can either raise their hands or you can use chat, which could work for folks who may not want to respond using audio. Okay. And let me know if these are hard questions at the end of the day, or just like hard in terms of, I know people are tired depending on what part of the world you're calling in from. It's already evening in California, so.
So I think that the second one you said, which was like they might not even mention it because it doesn't elicit the stereotypical image. But then again, I think about like what happened to Trayvon Martin, and like he was holding like, I think it was like Arizona and like chips.
Skittles, yes, Skittles and a bottle of Arizona iced tea.
Right. So it's very either or, I don't know.
And there's no wrong or right answer. It's just things to think about. And, when I was talking about certain objects, how they narrate closer proximities to whiteness, depending on, what region or area you're in. So I thought that was something that I do feel is kind of important to think about as we think about like food, not just in a vacuum, but within a racial caste system and whatever their current narratives are of the day. What are those closer proximities to whiteness in terms of food?
We also have Brian who has their hand raised.
Okay.
I guess like for me, this reminds me of was Elijah Mcclain. Because I think I was hearing in like I'm a part of the autistic community, and so I was hearing like people suspecting he was autistic. He was an introvert, and also people like in the animal liberation community talking about how he would play violin at the animal shelter because the cats would or just animals in general, I'm not sure, would get lonely. And so there was a lot of like people latched on to sort of the imagery of like innocence, and in that sense, like would they do the same if he didn't have those identities? And like why is it that non-black people like have to sort of have those images in order to like find find him as like close enough, I guess, to sort of advocate for.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to bring up. Thanks for bringing that up. I don't know if people are aware of Elijah Mcclain. I think he was killed at a gas station at where there's a package store, not package store, convenience store, I believe. He was killed there. I don't know if people are familiar with this.
Aurora, Colorado, I think.
What did you say? You said that again?
I think in Aurora, Colorado.
Okay, I couldn't remember. There's so many places and regions. But thanks. Yeah, I had thought about that too. Like he had closer proximity to whiteness by, he played his instrument for non-human animals and stuff like that. And I remember that being part of some of the conversations, and kind of that does bring up similar questions. So thanks for bringing that up. And say so. I see. I'm trying to figure this out. Someone is raising their hand, but I can't see who it is.
Sarah has her hand raised.
Yeah, I think that's me.
Oh, okay, Sarah. Now it's come up. Okay, Sarah, if you want to ask or respond.
Yeah, I think building off of what Brian said a little bit, I think that like within these white vegan circles, they might have like latched on to that imagery of like selling artisanal cheese and like being really acceptable. And I feel like at least this summer, you saw a lot of white people who generally don't care, like cared all of a sudden. And I think that might have been like the opportunity for them to kind of like feel like they were being a part of the movement and feel like they were contributing. And I think that it might have like completely flipped the script within white vegan spaces if this is what he was carrying.
Thank you, Sarah. And someone had written, I think some white vegans may have protested Michael Brown's killing and made it a point to bring up how there are food deserts and communities if he was selling vegan food. So you think that's what happened? And the thing is, we'll never know. These are kind of just thought exercises as I, read mainstream media recaps of certain events, and, lots of emphasis on certain things, right? So why such emphasis on that? Whether it's CDs or, cigarettes. So anybody else would have something to say verbally via audio? And I'm reading comments. Black children have had the cops call them for selling bottled water, so I don't really think it matters. Yeah, was that in Oakland, I think?
I think also it makes me think of like when it's brought up, like I guess, like for example, when in Elijah Mcclain's case, when his autism or his like suspected autism was brought up, it sort of like brought that proximity to the autistic community. But then like sometimes it's like bringing something up might be useful. Like for example, in Matthew Russian's case, bringing up autism like helped clarify some of the case.
Mm-hmm.
And so, whereas for, so like bringing something up, like like people oftentimes bring it up to invoke innocence versus like when, why is it that like when people bring up something, why is it not as something to like add nuance? For example, like bringing up how Elijah Mcclain was vegetarian, like why do people bring it up in order to invoke innocence instead of to invoke a sort of further invoke his anti-oppression? Mm-hmm. Like that his sort of ideology was sort of like in line with anti-oppression?
Yeah, those are all good questions. And then one question I'd ask too is, why does anything even have to be brought up just for someone to be humanized, who is a person of color? Those are just the larger issue or the broader issue that I wanted to inspire with those questions too. But I know a lot of it's contextual and it's just kind of hard to think about, but I'm trying to bring it back to just kind of like kind of centering trauma and I guess consumptive cultures, whether it's food or not. and really thinking about these things where we're thinking about the corner stores and the sites of surveillance. But also a lot of the focus that I'm interested in is also, this concept of ethical food and green capitalism. And I kind of wanted to move on to the next section to discuss this in the next few minutes as we let other people, talk and have their comments. So if other people wanted to answer this question, whether they want to raise their hand or put in comments, that'd be great. And if not, that's fine. I know some people may want to submit things anonymously. So another question I wanted to ask also is, drawing from what I spoke about from Thug Kitchen, can you think about other ways in which the trauma of racial violence and injustice has been culturally appropriated within ethical foods, commodities, culture? So that's probably a huge, thing to think about. But for instance, there are certain foods that have and still do have this history and current day practices of it takes violence, and it's very traumatizing for those who are part of, extracting it. It takes violence and it's traumatizing to get that commodity to the more privileged consumer. So I'm kind of thinking about, other ways in which that is erased in the ethical foods space, which I'm sure there are plenty of examples, but I do think about that a lot. So Thug Kitchen, it's more of a cookbook that we're talking about, and the appropriation of the word thug, and it's culture appropriated, and then it's kind of put in this realm of, but it's for veganism, and it's in this ethical commodities culture. So we're kind of sanitizing that history, and we're using it for our own with good intentions, because veganism, by default is just going to have excellent outcomes. So it doesn't matter if we create a Thug Kitchen book or not, or use some other method, as long as it focuses on veganism. So I wanted to expand further on that question. Are there any herbs or foods or other practices that you can think of that has kind of a history of racial violence and injustice, but then has been culturally appropriated, that history has been made invisible, and then it's kind of been prepared for an ethical foods commodity culture in the United States or other places?
I wouldn't say like I have another example for ethical, but in terms of non-ethical, in meaning like McDonald's, like I have noticed that like the consistent use of like African dialectic language to sell their food is like very prevalent within their commercials.
Mm-hmm. And when you say non-ethical or ethical, I put ethical in quotes because it's like, it's such a subjective thing. So that's why I put it in quotes.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else who hasn't, oh wait, I would like to read some of the comments. So someone said, and this may be in reference to what I had asked as a first question. What immediately comes to mind is the sudden attacks to street vendors who are Hispanic or Latinx paleteros and eloteros in Southern Los Angeles. Then Nassim said, there was someone who was selling hot dogs in Berkeley, actually, whose money was taken because he didn't have a vending license, I think. And then Noel, what came to mind was the use of sage and other natural herbs being used by non-Indigenous peoples. Sarah said, I'm not sure if this directly answers a question. And there's no wrong or right way. This is all about kind of inspiring us to think about, alternative ways that we may have never thought about before. I'm not sure if this directly answers the question, but what comes to mind is the comparison between industrial agricultural practices and chattel slavery, internment camps, and other types of human trauma experienced at the hands of oppressive systems. Brian Liu says, I think there was a video on avocados and how hard it is to cultivate Indigenous farmers defending avocado plantation that people don't often think about. So yeah, that's something that, yeah, avocados and many other plant-based foods having those sorted histories. Saging as a practice, so someone's talking about sage again. Saging as a practice by non-Indigenous people, not food, but a practice. Bananas. the overpricing of oxtails now seen and put into white cuisines. As a Jamaican, I remember my mom saying that oxtails were poor man's foods, the scraps of slaves. I also think about farmers who come from Mexico to grow tomatoes in Florida and how they are treated, which could be seen as modern day slavery. Yeah, I think the Omowakole, sorry that I'm making the, if someone can correct me, that they're the workers who were harvesting tomatoes in Florida. And I'm just going to type this in because the Omokali workers in Florida who are like asking just for a few pennies per pound more from Wendy's, and they weren't getting it. I don't even know if it's unclear if they even got, that. Okay. So thanks. Anything else? Did anyone else raise their hand who wanted to talk? Who hasn't talked yet? I just want to make sure because I have a lot of people up. So anyone else? Okay. Let me try to get back to what we were talking about. Okay. So the next part of this that I wanted to talk, engage with you is something that's a little more, I guess, new. Some of the work that I'm doing, or it's still focusing on these intersections. So I'm trying to take all of these concepts over the past 13 years of me doing this work, what it means to create a future of food that's maybe plant-based, more ethical, but still, what does it mean when capitalism is not questioned? And also thinking about the trauma and violence that goes into food production since the last 400 years, and how the United States was built as a nation through those violences and genocide. So I think trauma is just really important to not forget about, and think about ways. What can the alternatives basically look like in the future? So I have this Afrofuturistic book. It's called Seeds of Sankofa, and I take these theories a step further and show that currently concepts like racial capitalism and anti-Blackness continue to map out and pave the future of food, ethics, and sustainability when it comes to like mainstream conversations and what goes in the news and what gets financially supported. So let me just share a little bit of this kind of work and process. So in Seeds of Sankofa, I show how there can be a green capitalist society that is plant-based, i.e. vegan or cruelty-free, and still can be contingent upon racial capitalism to keep it alive. And I bring this up because for all the last 10 years of me being on social media, I have seen the theory that, if the whole world just went vegan, if the whole world just went plant-based, then from there, all the isms would disappear. And I actually think that that is not going to happen if it's still within the logics of capitalism. So in this book, my focus is on hemp and the fictional crop Jeziek, they're constructed as ethical, pure, and green objects of consumption to tell this complex story. So throughout the novel, I make references to food and consumptive systems of abuse and oppression. And the goal is to articulate the nuances of violence from the micro scale to the macro scale. In the years 2019, but in the future also 2311, and explore how food can also be used to understand trauma and create futures of hope and resilience, and eventually liberation and freedom. So the protagonist, Dr. Sankofa Durant, is a Black maternal nutrition consultant blessed with a powerful psychic ability, and she's living in the San Francisco Bay Area. And through Dr. Durant, Seeds of Sankofa invites the reader to explore racial, maternal, and food justice, and also like the devastation of these traumatic processes to create the way the current food system is now in the United States. And I have these questions that I do ask, which is, what can hemp and other plant-based commodities in Seeds of Sankofa tell us about racial capitalism and Black maternal justice? How do these food objects influence the future of ethics and sustainability? How can we use the writing arts, critical food studies, and Afrofuturism to engender better paradigms for justice beyond dystopian and pessimistic futures? And how can we explore trauma, resilience, and healing within the foodscape? So part of this presentation would have me basically reading this to you, this novel, an excerpt, so you can kind of get a sense of how I'm using the art form of novel writing to really kind of question, green capitalism is like, what is the efficacy of that? And can capitalism ever be equitable if we understand its, future since the last 400 years. So I think that's really important. And then also thinking about particular commodities that have been constructed as ethical and moral, especially within the plant-based or vegan world. So I'm going to start reading this to you. And it is a book in progress. And it takes place in Oakland. It's the prologue, April 3rd, 2012. And I'll do my best to change voices so you know who's talking. So this takes place in Oakland, California. And right now, the scene is in a cafe and a television is on, and whoever is in the cafe is actually listening to who's speaking. So the person who's speaking begins. And Dr. Lewis, we're seeing protests throughout the USA and even in the United Kingdom since Trayvon Martin passed away. Then the commentators interrupted. Now let's be clear, Daniel. Trayvon was a child who was murdered. Let's not forget why and how he passed away, how he died. CNN guest Dr. Pearl Lily Lewis interrupts CNN anchor Daniel Thompson III. As she continues to speak, her title as Spelman Professor of Economics hangs at the bottom of the 60-inch flat screen monitor mounted on the wall at Tinder Cafe on Telegraph Avenue in Oakland, California. Just over the Berkeley city limit, Tinder is a regular hotspot for the handful of Black public health graduate students attending University of California, Berkeley. They are the only patrons in there at the moment, with the exception of an elderly white woman wearing KALE t-shirt and tie-dye jeans, sipping an espresso in the corner on the other side. Sitting on a purple love seat, Milton sips his kombucha while his boyfriend Tyler snuggles close to him, both sets of eyes on the flat screen TV. Tyler yawns, fatigued from just finishing a double shift for his residency program at Elta Bates Hospital. Again, he glances at the woman who is sitting on a silver matte colored metal bar stool across from them. He wonders how it's comfortable for her. They had offered to give up the sofa for her, but she had declined. She looked like she was at the tail end of her third trimester of pregnancy. A black and bronze painted dashiki dress covered her swollen belly. A fluffy jet black voluminous afro with reddish blonde highlights crowns her umber colored body. Lustrous coils dance on top of her head as strong winds blow through the open door across the cafe. She caresses her belly, eyes glued to the screen, awaiting Dr. Lewis's next sentence. Milton whispers to his boyfriend, I see her around the department. She's a PhD student, quiet, doesn't really say much. I totally forgot her name. Samantha? No, maybe Sally? Eyes go back onto the screen. Dr. Lewis speaks. I mean, we need to really dig deep into what is happening here, Daniel. Yes, tens of thousands of people in the United States are decrying the fact that a child has been killed. His murder, a clear sign of antebellum slavery's lingering legacy of anti-Black racism, Dr. Lewis continues, her perfectly manicured sister locks barely touching her small shoulders, covered by a black and white checkered pattern dress. And Daniel responds, index cards in his left hand. He says, so, now, Dr. Lewis, we have hundreds of people sending empty Skittles wrappers to the police chief, who is now investigating Martin's murder. And she responds, yes, protesters are re-symbolizing Skittles from Taste the Rainbow to a symbol against racial profiling and anti-Black racism, the trauma that shouldn't be silenced or made invisible. You get that, Daniel. And he says, I do. And then she continues, I get that. I mean, this is the obvious story that news media outlets like CNN, MSNBC, and Reuters have been telling us. But Daniel, there's another story that I saw. And she shifts her weight in the white vinyl upholstered chair in the newsroom. And she says, protesters are holding a wrapper to a commodity produced by Mars Inc. Now, this is a corporation that uses modern day global South slavery for their sugar and cocoa sourcing. Their whole profit model is embedded in the tradition of so-called colonial plantation, in which Black and brown people are not treated as human beings at all, but as disposable and exploitable working objects within the global capitalist system. There was so much going on in my mind when I met this little Black boy the other month at a rally who had stapled about 30 empty Skittles wrappers all over his shirt, and he was munching on a small bag of M&Ms, also a Mars Inc. product. And if you were to visit these cacao plantations, Daniel, you see that they're cruel, they're brutal, and you don't see people who look like you harvesting these crops. And Daniel interrupts, you mean there are no 78-year-old white men with a third at the end of their name? And then she continues. So here is a little boy who does look like one of these enslaved children on a Ghanaian cacao plantation. Here is a little Black boy about 10 years old, terrified and traumatized that he too is just going to be another moving target for a trigger-happy racist while eating a bag of candy that exists because Mars Inc., like Zimmerman, have concluded that Black people are not only worthy of preemptive strike, but should only exist within the rubric of antebellum plantation logic. Zimmerman and Mars Inc. function within plantation logic, Zimmerman being an arm and identifiable extension of this mentality. And now here we have this little Black boy in Baltimore caught within trying to survive in a racist America, survive in a city, Baltimore, in which companies like Mars Inc. target minority communities with nutritionally vapid foods because we are simply a means to an end, profit and control. Now, this little boy's mother and father were eating hamburgers from Wendy's, a corporation that uses incarcerated laborers to process their beef patties. This is, as Professor Michelle Alexandra would say, the new Jim Crow. This mother told me Wendy's is a more cheaper way for their family to afford to eat meat several times a week. It is in an area of food apartheid. And don't let anyone tell you these regions are called food deserts. Deserts are naturally occurring. Apartheid is strategically engineered. We also can't forget that the coalition of Mcclain farm workers in Florida who harvest the tomatoes for Wendy's and others. They're currently fighting for thriving wages and sanitary living conditions. Wendy's refuses to pay these human beings a few more pennies per pound of tomatoes that they harvest, a few pennies, and they suffer greatly. Now, last Tuesday, I was at the Economies of Sustainability and Ethics Symposium at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. This year's topic was about the cannabis sativa industry. As you know, California is trying to pass laws to legalize cannabis. We see a growing trend in marketing cannabis as a sustainable crop. And just for the audience who's listening, this is taking place in 2012. Now, we also got so many of my brothers and sisters in prison for having a smidgen of weed on them during the 3 strikes and you're out era of policing Black and brown bodies, families torn apart. And now we're moving toward legalizing it. I'm gonna say it now, there darn well better be reparations and exonerations for those brothers and sisters in prison for weed selling and possession. And like any new and rising industry in which a product and service were once criminalized because of association with Blackness or indigeneity, it will be commodified. Mostly white businessmen and politicians are spearheading the cannabis industry. VCs were at that conference and they were on them like cold on ice. And then Daniel, the commentator on CNN, interrupts her and says, but cannabis is such a sustainable crop. I don't think this could be comparable to cacao and sugar plantations you refer to, owned by Mars or Hershey, can they? Or to Wendy's and the coalition of Mcclain farm workers, he notes. And then she responds, the government and media demonized Black and brown people for being in possession with it. Cannabis was a sacred herb. Right now, go on to Facebook and you'll see supporters of Zimmerman sharing photos and videos of Trayvon smoking quote unquote weed. So I guess we're supposed to be in fear of him, and this naturally justifies his murder as an illegal drug user. This isn't about ethics or sustainability. This is about profit and commodities, control and surveillance. The two concepts are bedfellows. We can't be naive in this. The mainstream economists go on and on ad nauseum about cannabis as part of this new green capitalism, as the savior. Purple, pink, blue, or yellow, capitalism is still capitalism, and the high costs are always racialized. So here I am in this room of mostly economists, business professors, and CEOs of cannabis startups. I'm literally the only colorful dot in that ocean of whiteness, and I'm pretty sure that I'm the only Marxist economist in that room. And they're talking about the future of cannabis, food, and technology. These men were talking about envisioning the possibility that the USA will one day shift towards being a cannabis-centered economy, hemp textiles, hemp-based food, medicinals, etc. I then thought about the numerous plantations I had visited in the global South, but also here in California, with migrant workers under the harshest conditions to even harvest organic strawberries or organic almonds. So-called quote unquote ethical products from cannabis are not the answer to solving all global inequities, particularly since a corporate environmental food regime has been quickly emerging post-2000 that is undergirded by the continued logics of capitalism. And I turned to that table and I asked, who do you think will be exploited to harvest these crops for your new green future? Whose land will be grabbed and what communities will be torn apart to create such a scale of production for your ethical and sustainable capitalism? And gee whiz, Batman, what an oxymoron, ethical capitalism? There's the naturalization and the continuation of the plantation with green capitalism. I wouldn't be surprised if, say, 100 years from now, that Hemp Inc., or whatever it is will be called, is the new Mars Inc., and we're still holding up those wrappers in protest of our ongoing killings, end quote. So yes, thank you for sitting with that. I read it more as if it were a play and kind of took out some of the more descriptive things. But I read this just to kind of get a sense of, once again, appropriating certain things that were sacred, the land grabbing, and I question, what the future of hemp would be, what the future of a plant-based economy would be, if it's still entrenched in capitalism. So that's what this book is about. That's just the prologue. But the point is, it's Afrofuturistic, and it also pans out 300 years in the future, where in fact, the earth is doomed and damned. Someone like Elon Musk has a technology to go and terraform and colonize Mars. And in a dystopian, kind of a dystopian future, it's determined that those that can pay back their debts to society because maybe they were selling weed or engaged in drugs, they will be shipped to this new planet to actually grow hemp. So it's kind of, futuristic, but it really kind of talks about this. So now they're growing hemp, but it's still a plantation culture. And those who have access to these new ethical, more healthy products are still the elite, mostly white or light skin. So I'm just really kind of trying to bring this concept in of the continuation of a violent and traumatizing food system, even if it were within green capitalism, and even if we were shifting toward cannabis or hemp. So that's not the only future, but I'm questioning those futures in this book as we talk. And all of this kind of comes up because of my experience with kind of the constant microaggressions and traumatic statements, though with good intentions, from a lot of the mainstream, a lot of startups, food startups, that are very much focused on the way to a more sustainable future are these plant-based commodities, right? In green capitalism. And then I look at mostly who's being resourced, who's being funded, who's making these decisions. We've got Silicon Valley, we've got mostly people who've been only on the privileged side of consumerism most of their lives, and they're kind of creating these futures within that rubric and that logic. And me questioning, like, actually, it's totally possible 100 or 200 years from now to still have these racial injustices, even if we have Hemp Inc. So I'm going to leave it with that. That's kind of the preface of the book. I'm about 70 pages into writing it. But it involves these 4 Black heroines who are able to travel throughout time. And there's different references to certain foods and herbs, the future of hemp, and also other herbs, and Africa's botanical legacy to the Americas. So just all of these references as we kind of tackle how can we be resilient and how can there be hope and build these futures of food with these 4 Black women who kind of know the future because they can go into it, but how can they prevent it and create a more positive, just future that doesn't rely on capitalism, and to kind of start healing that trauma and find a different way. So I'm going to stop. And I see that we have about 10 minutes left. That's kind of how I want to talk about these things. And if people it's hard to read a book because the way I write, I actually, I was just reading the quotes. But if you would like to, I have 60 pages of this. And the focus of this is this person who's a professor who's talking, that there's focus, they're maternal health activists. So I'm really focusing on food justice and seeds. The book is called Seeds of Sankofa, and like the many ways in which like Sankofa, looking to the future while looking back, what it means to plant seeds spiritually, but also, to cultivate and build. So there's a lot of that. And these food justice, maternal justice women who are trying to understand right now, what does the future of hemp mean? Noticing gentrification in Oakland, there are these maternal justice activists understanding Black health and morbidity and mortality rates are much higher, but noticing that their clients just don't have access to what they need. And that currently one of, which is based on a true story, Sacred Birthplace in Oakland, which I used for my pregnancies, I focus on the shutting down of places like this, and then I create a fictive reason why, is that it's being replaced by a cannabis-centered store and spa that's more for women people who are pregnant and they want to kind of get the benefits of cannabis. So it's been gentrified through that, and the clientele will be more or less pregnant people who are mostly white, who would be more apt to afford that through gentrification, versus these maternal health justice activists who are kind of being kicked out of their more traditional ways of doing these practices. So it seems like it's all intersectional, like really understanding that, but also like the trauma of, being torn apart from wherever you were in Africa when enslavement of Africans in the Middle Passage happened. So kind of going back and forth and understanding that and what that means and what these four protagonists can do, and understanding that through time travel and what the current perceptions of food justice and technocracy and green capitalism, they're already seeing that it's failing because of the higher maternal mortality rates, the fact that their clients don't have the foods that they need, the housing that they need. So I use a lot of what's occurring in the Bay Area, the rise in homelessness, and gentrification, and then also just like the constant more funding and support of ethical food startups, in which those who are disenfranchised the most, historically Indigenous, Black folk, Latinx folk, they're not actually part of it. They're not getting that support, that funding. It's being kind of spearheaded and run by pretty much the same type of people that benefited from colonialism and capitalism from jump. So that's what Seeds of Sankofa is dealing with. And I want to thank everyone for kind of listening to this kind of book in progress as kind of a culmination of what I'm trying to bring like to the next level in terms of novel writing and Afrofuturism, to address this concept of unpacking food trauma, but that whole history of the trauma of how we got to this food system to begin with, and all those intersectional pieces that we can't ignore, and that we can't ignore, at least in the mainstream and more privileged spaces. So with that said, are there things that come up for people, questions? Please raise your hand and let me know. So someone says there's a book out there called An Unkindness of Ghosts that sounds a bit like the book. It's based in the future and everyone is on a massive ship. And of course, there's violently enforced racial hierarchy. Yeah, it's I haven't heard of that, but I was thinking of the book, not the book, but the short story by, is it Charles Mills? I'm sorry if I got that wrong. The Race Traders, Space Traders, Race Traders, Space Traders, which kind of reminds me of that too. So I'm just kind of thinking about these things in terms of like fighting against this dystopian future and what a more optimistic future would look like. And I've been greatly influenced by Octavia Butler's work. I don't know of people, but I'm definitely in the Octavia Butler camp. So I want to leave it open for the next, I guess, Dr. Breeze, you have social media where you can, oh yes. Yeah, Octavia Butler, yeah, she was a seer, a prophet, yes, oh my goodness. Like, I don't know if you read Parable of the Sower in California. I think we're headed toward, is it 2024 that it takes place? It's actually eerily precise on where we're headed. Yeah. And there's a podcast called Octavia Tried to Warn Us. I think that's what it's called, or Octavia Tried to Tell Us. I'm on Instagram as Sister Vegan. I'm always babbling about this stuff. That's my Instagram.
I think I have a question.
Yes.
So in the forward, I think something that you talked about was like that was probably going to be addressed in Sister Vegan. And as I continue to read, I'll figure it out. But I think you were talking about what particularly the role that green capitalism could or should play in the potential liberation of Black people. And I was wondering, like, since you are writing Caesar Sankofa, like, is that a prelude to like that it can't, or is it still some way, or, you know?
Yeah. FYI, to let people know, like Sister Vegan, I wrote in 2010, the preface, and then, put together the anthology with other people. And that's how I was thinking in 2010. So my thinking is always changing as I learn more and more. I don't know anymore. I'm just I'm very suspicious of capitalism in general. I'm not saying green capitalism can't work or any type of capitalism, but I have not been, I have not been persuaded to believe it can. So I'm trying to figure out how that would work in Seeds of Sankofa. I mean, there'll probably be more critiques of it showing the inconsistencies, which I'm not showing anything new. I'm just trying to add Afrofuturism to it. So I'm trying to figure out what those alternatives could look like. Not the exact same thing, but I'm also thinking about, yeah, someone said I haven't found evidence that capitalism supports humanity. It doesn't make sense. So I'm trying to think of alternatives and possibilities. I'm still decolonizing my mind around all this stuff. I really enjoy reading Black Marxism. I tried to, but because I have 4 kids and had no childcare when I signed up for it, and I'll send this to people who are interested. I was enrolled in the class, start taking like decolonial economies. Out of a collective of doulas and midwives in Mexico, just showing what those alternatives could look like. But I have all the literature, I have to read it, but like that's what I'm trying to figure out and what that future could look like. I just don't know. I mean, and you don't mess with capitalism. That's the thing. It's dangerous. I know like Martin Luther King Jr., was he assassinated because he was, trying to promote racial equity in beloved community, or is it because he became incredibly vocal about the horrors of capitalism? Like, okay, dude, we can talk about racial equality as long as you support capitalism. Those are the things I'm thinking about. Someone wrote, let's see, yeah. So I think it's just like an ecocidal system, and it's hard to like disentangle from it because a lot of us are, we're enmeshed and entangled in it. And that's the problem. It's like, how do I untangle myself from it? Because we're still benefiting from it. I mean, if we're all using smart devices or phones to even be part of this conference, that all of those materials and things came from some type of suffering and torture and traumatizing things. So not just talking about foods, but all this stuff. So it's hard. It's a big entity to go up against, but I'm just trying to figure out, and the trauma piece is just really important as I'm thinking more for support for Black, Indigenous people of color. How can we understand, and navigate through this, like it's a traumatic system. Racial caste is it was built on trauma and violence, right? And it continues, but it's been normalized through things like capitalism and then trying to create just food systems while we're trying to work within a broken system. Well, it's not really broken. It was designed to function this way. And those are the things that I'm trying to figure out through this book and just writing and reading, and we'll see. Like I said, I've written like 70 pages or 60 pages so far, and it's a difficult book to write. And I don't know if anyone's read any Black Marxism. I'm reading Cedric Robinson's book for like the second time. It's hard, but really good. Read. And then, just broadly, I wrote Sister Vegan like 12 years ago, and now it's like 2021, and I'm just kind of rethinking even like the ways in which veganism has been constructed within even more Afrocentric and Black community spaces, and just kind of thinking about, have we really thought about capitalism to a deep degree? Many spaces have, but many spaces do not as well. So just try to think about those alternatives, and to what degree should I be thinking about decolonizing that space as a scholar, like looking at those spaces and looking at through decolonial analysis, and what that would mean. So I don't know if people have been in certain spaces where it's there's a focus on, which I know there's different ways to figure out how empowerment, but like, I'm thinking about Black business ownership and stuff. I'm like, well, it's still within capitalism, but that's the alternative we have for wealth building. So in what ways is that still not ethical? So those are the things I'm thinking about. What are the alternatives? I don't know. If anyone has any suggestions, let me know. But
I mean, something that I've been like really looking into was sustainable regenerative design, and then also just the use of like waste for like the creation of products is like what I'm really exploring in my area of like green capitalism. Because like something that I've currently consistently read like while going to Berkeley and like in the library is that they don't, when they talk about green capitalism, it's not necessarily, okay, use the waste or anything else. It's just like still going out to grab new resources, but like ethically, or like growing it and using it later instead of just finding in the wild or something like that. So something that I'm like exploring for myself is just like, how can we turn waste into like a commodity that can be sold? So yeah.
that sounds cool. Yeah, I've noticed that there's quite a few folk who are doing that, or revisiting what was done already before colonialism. Like you use the entire product, or you use the not product, you use the entire plan, or there isn't a waste. Like the concept of waste, it just isn't a concept, right? So
No,
but I also think it's interesting. I don't know. I like you can already understand I'm biased just by the way I'm thinking about these things, but just like the amount of startup funding for certain concepts, and let's just say it, like startup fund, they already proved it. You have more of a chance of getting startup funding if you're a white cisgender man with an Ivy League education. Okay, so a lot of folk who get these fundings for new ideas that I'm like, well, these ideas probably existed, and they have existed before colonization. So just trying to figure that out too. I don't know if that makes sense, but like I saw things like, here's, why use toxic water-laden detergent when you can use soap nuts, and I'm like, well, this isn't anything new, but now you're getting funding for it. You're getting millions of dollars of funding for it. Or I don't know, just all these things. So I'm just trying to figure out that, right? So we already have the in terms of talking about Black and white racial wealth gap, we already have that, but then you're still like, these funders are still funding the same type of thoughts and people as if they're new ideas. So it's like all this stuff that I'm thinking about in terms of resources that are just not provided.
yeah.
Because I work a lot as an anti-racist consultant with a lot of these companies, try to get them to understand, like, the problem is that you're getting funded to do this or that. It's increasing your wealth. You're doing it in a way that's not equitable, that's still within capitalism. Of course, they're not going to really, think about an alternative because they're not going to make a profit. But those are the things I'm trying to think about. And shifting more of that, like how do you shift more of that wealth and resources to like the communities that really need it, and actually could probably design it in a way where it actually is more sustainable, equitable, and doesn't necessarily rely on capitalism. But I guess that's not the VC world because it's all about capitalism. So with that said, it's like 8:33, I realize, and I want to kind of stop talking and open it up to other people who have not spoken yet.
There are a few anonymous questions that were submitted. Would it be okay to answer those?
Yes.
So the first one is, how do you envision non-Black vegans and vegetarians of color creating long-lasting systems of support and solidarity with the Black community?
I think at least right now, just I think it's with any community that you're not familiar with, is to understand the histories of how we all got to where we are. So for that, I mean, like for instance, especially since last year with the racial injustices, really the focus on Black racism, where I saw a lot of Asian communities, Asian diaspora saying, let's get together and understand how anti-Blackness and colorism affect our communities. So really talking about that, yes, as Asians, we encounter specifically anti-Asian racism, but let's also have conversations about how anti-Blackness has played into our communities for the benefit of us within like white supremacy. So I think that's really important to kind of understand, all of that together and that entanglement and that type of solidarity, and not to get caught up in the scarcity and abundance wars, the groups pitted against each other, but to really understand those histories, and understanding that history can create better solidarity. And I'd say that also too with Black communities, where many of us may not understand the specific history of, anti-Asian racism, to understand that, and that understanding those histories, how you were racialized this way and how you're treated in that caste system, and understanding it as a goal to kind of perpetuate white supremacy, and to understand that, we're being pitted against each other versus trying to be more in solidarity is really important. So I think that's how I would say to go for it, because I've seen that it's easy to be pitted against each other, or you can just understand, hey, white supremacy is our common enemy in capitalism. It may manifest differently for maybe East Asians versus East Asians versus maybe South Asians versus Blacks in America versus Jamaicans and Black and the Jamaican, but we're still kind of all influenced by that, and we all need to fight it. So I think that's the important thing to hold on to. So someone said was going to say this has been an ongoing conversation in SSW ANA communities. Yeah, so I think that's really important, and also just even within. I think it's, people don't want to hear it, but not just the anti-racism aspect, but to really start questioning capitalism, right? Because I know it has been very helpful for so many of our communities. Like my dad just sent me a long story about how my great grandfather left Jim Crow and barely survived to raise a family in Detroit, and starting his own business, right? So in that aspect, he was able to join capitalism and kind of get out of there. But then, okay, but now what do we do? How can we move on from there? So I think that's really important to really think about to the limits of capitalism when we're talking about empowerment in communities of color. Yeah. So I hear my son screaming, "Mama!" He's a baby, so I'm getting distracted. He'll survive, so he'll be fine. Okay. I know that I have learned a lot about caste in the past year from the South Asian community. We in the Western world wrongly assume that most of India is vegetarian. Oh, okay, yeah. And interestingly, there's a lot of cultural appropriation around the word ahimsa and veganism, and it's something to look into, because I forgot their name. I'm sorry. I'll have to send it to Nasim as a list of resources, but they have a podcast. She's Indian, and she actually talks about caste in India and tries to explain that it isn't, Rama. To tries to explain caste in India, and that casteism is something that you have to understand, and not think that ahimsa-based vegetarianism or veganism can be applied in the United States as it's some pure thing that's not been deeply influenced by the caste system in India. So I think it's another thing that people have to really think about when we're thinking about our best intentions and good intentions in the United States, but we're still ignorant of a lot of the words that we take and appropriate and think that they're applicable to creating equity, when in fact it has this like sordid history of like supremacy and disenfranchisement. Okay, and anybody else? And I do have to leave in a few minutes, I'm sorry, because my kids, I have to put my child to bed and I nurse him to sleep. Yeah, thanks. Someone put in the link to Rama's, veganism should be anti-caste. So, and I'm glad that she's, bringing this more into the forefront, because I was also ignorant. If you read Sister Vegan, I talk about ahimsa, and she and I had talked about that. She's like, "Why are you using that word?" I'm like, "I don't know, it means like, cruelty-free and stuff." So she's like, "Let me school you." So that was really humbling, because I don't know, right? Instead of being defensive, I'm like, of course, I want to know, because I also didn't understand it. So she was really, really pivotal in me understanding why I shouldn't be using ahimsa within the United States vegan like context to talk about cruelty free, because she's like, it's not if you understand caste in India.
So yeah, we do want to respect your time and attendees' time. So we can close out pretty quickly. There is one last question which can be sent out in the form of an email to attendees, and someone had asked, like, I want to compile a reading list for the summer and fall. What are your suggestions? I don't know if you want to answer that now or just let me know and I can send that out to folks.
Yeah, I can't think about it now. I have an Airtable list of all these books because we have clients who always ask us stuff. So I have like 700 sources ranging from videos to articles. So I can do that.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, I'm really like, I know a lot of people like academic books, but I'm just really blown away by novels and the new novels that have come out. So I'm just really blown away by what they can do. So that's why I'm doing a lot of novel writing to address those things. And yeah, and if you haven't already, Octavia Butler, hello. So Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talent would be one book that I would suggest, even though it was written a long time ago. And we're all, most of us calling it are in California. It takes place in California, I believe 2024. And like, she is spot on with everything that is happening. It's actually pretty eerie. Yeah, like the droughts and the wildfires and the United States having a fanatical president that was like synonymous to Trump and all this stuff. It's actually pretty amazing. And that it ended up just kind of deteriorating the infrastructure and the economy. And yeah, I won't give away too much more. Yeah, it is terrifying, but I think hopefully it will terrify a lot of people enough to make sure we kind of go the better course. Okay, everyone, thank you. My child wants to nurse. So with that said, thank you. This was experimental for me, by the way. So it wasn't as polished as I usually would like things to be, but I'm trying to push myself to really understanding trauma-informed practices. And I'm still at the beginning of it, but I just wanted to say I really thank you. I think a majority of people on here are younger than me, so I also think it's important to understand like what's going on. I'm 45, so I'm Gen Xer, and I really want to know, also what's coming in from the minds of people that are, I guess, is it millennials or Gen Z? Gen Z. So it's really important for me to know what's going on, not just with Gen Xers and baby boomers. So thanks everyone for holding that space. And inviting me into that space, and I'm letting you know what's going on in my mind. So, okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you, Dr. Harper, for your amazing workshop.
Thank you.